Good evening, Albemarle County. I'm Emily Kilroy. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Engagement for Albemarle County Government, and I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing to the community Colonel Sean Reeves, who's with us here tonight, and he's our new Chief of Police. We'll be announcing some opportunities to meet the Chief out in the community over the next several weeks, but we really didn't want to waste any time starting to have a conversation with you all about who Colonel Reeves is and some of his priorities for his department and also our community over the next over his tenure. So feel free to submit questions as we go along. If you're with us on Zoom tonight, you can use the Q&A pod. And if you're with us on Facebook Live, please feel free to just submit questions through the comments. And as we get towards the end of our conversation, we'll start to bring in some of your questions for the Chief. So we are together. We're 6 feet apart right now. Colonel Reeves, before we dive into our questions, this is a room that before last week I had never actually been into. So tell us, where are we tonight, and what is this room used for?
Well, thank you, Emily, for the warm introduction, and thank you everybody at home for tuning in and watching this evening and joining us. You are live with us in the Albemarle County Police Department headquarters off of 5th Street, and this room is actually our roll call room. This is where our officers pre-pandemic will come every single shift, daylight shift, evening shift, and midnight shift, to come in and get their sector assignments, go over any critical information and any important information that's needed for the evening before the officers begin their tour of duty. So
if you're not part of the police department, this is a room that typically most people are never going to see.
Correct. Unless you're doing a tour of the police department, this is for our patrol officers exclusively.
Well, thank you for having us here, and it does feel special to be in this room. So you're only the 6th Chief of Police for Albemarle County, which I found really interesting. Given that we're almost 300 years old as a county. Can you start by sharing a little bit about the department's history?
Yes, absolutely. The Albemarle County Police Department was formed in 1983 under Sheriff Chief Bailey. And before that, the primary law enforcement function was part of the Albemarle County Sheriff's Department. So after 1983, the responsibility split. So the Sheriff's Department now is responsible for courtroom security, as well as civil paper services and prisoner transport, as well as assisting us with mental health transportation. Whereas the police department is led by a chief of police and is responsible for the daily services provided to citizens when they pick up the phone and call 911.
Awesome. And one of the things that really stands out about your appointment as chief is that you're actually the first police chief for Albemarle County that rose through the ranks. So you started your law enforcement career here in Albemarle, and you've had a lot of hats along the way before rising to chief. The county executive has shared that one of the things that stood out for him is that as a leader now, you have been in the shoes of almost every position in the police department and almost every staff person that you now have the responsibility of leading. How does that feel?
Well, as I've said multiple times throughout the week, it is truly, I'm humbled and I'm honored to be the first patrol officer to rise to the ranks to become chief of police. I certainly didn't get here alone. We have a very talented police department, and I've been fortunate enough to work with some very talented men and women alongside them that have supported me, and we've leaned on each other throughout the years to help me achieve this. And being the chief of police comes with a tremendous amount of responsibility, and it is a position that I don't take lightly. And having served throughout the different shifts, the different patrol shifts, I began my career back in 2001 on midnight shift as a patrol officer. And then I've had experience working as a supervisor on evening shift, a patrol officer in daylight shift, a detective that worked property crimes as well as robbery cases. Spent some time in internal affairs, about 3 years, working with Colonel Steve Sellers, one of my mentors under internal affairs, which provided me with a very different lens on how I looked at law enforcement. I also have a SWAT background and spent time as a criminal investigation division commander, as well as our community support division. So yes, I have gone around the police department, and what I found with my approach is it gave me an opportunity to reinvent myself and learn different aspects of law enforcement. We're fortunate here in Albemarle County to have a mid-sized agency that has so many opportunities for officers to do. If you like traffic, you can become a traffic officer. If you're into investigative work, you can become a detective. If you're into canines, we have a canine program. So there's a lot of opportunities within the police department for officers coming in.
What does it mean to an officer, a frontline patrol officer working on midnights right now, to know that someone is leading the department that's been exactly where they are?
Well, I would hope it would mean to the officer that there is an opportunity that I could set a standard within the police department that if you work hard and you invest and you stay dedicated to the police department and better yourself and continue to learn and continue to evolve in this profession, that you too can become the chief of police here in the Albemarle County Police Department, and that the Albemarle County as a government doesn't necessarily have to continue to look for outside where we can grow our own internal candidates to become fill these leadership roles within our organization.
So before you joined so you started your law enforcement career here in Albemarle, but before you joined law enforcement, you served in the U.S. Army. Can you tell us a little bit about your service there?
Yes. So shortly after graduating high school, I was actually born and raised in Houston, Texas, and joined the Army coming out of high school. And I served 5 years active duty, and I was stationed in Northern Virginia for 5 years at Fort Myer, where I was a military police officer. And then I got out prior to the tragic events of 9/11. And then when I was at the police academy, the terrorist attacks of 9/11 occurred. And shortly thereafter, while I was working with the Albemarle County Police Department, I was recalled back to active duty status. And during that time, I was stationed down at Central Command, where I had the opportunity to travel overseas throughout Africa, Europe, and the Middle East in support of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. And after my honorable discharge in 2003, Albemarle County Police Department held my job open and held it for me. So I came back, and Albemarle County's been loyal to me all these years, and I found it fitting that I was give that loyalty back to them and work hard and ultimately end up here as chief of police.
Awesome. So let's talk about your formal education. You joined the military after high school, but you actually went back and got 2 degrees later in life. What made you go back to school?
I did. So when Colonel Steve Sellers came to the police department back in 2011 timeframe, he made some fundamental changes to the way we conducted police operations. He brought with him geo-based policing. He did some restructuring, and I had the opportunity to work closely with him when I was in internal affairs for 3 years. And during that time, he had a conversation with me, and this was roughly about 10 years ago now, that I had the potential to be a chief of police here one day. He saw something in me that I didn't necessarily see, but he also put in context that in order to achieve chief of police, you need to have a degree, because a degree makes a good leader better. So with that, I enrolled into college, and I was a full-time student for 5 years. And not only did I obtain my bachelor's degree, I obtained my master's degree. And I owe a lot of where I am today for that little push he gave me 10 years ago.
That's really great. It must have been so hard to balance school with all of your duties as a police officer.
It was a challenge, but I also use as lesson learned to other officers too that are struggling, and I encourage them because it brings out those critical thinking skills, and it does make good leaders better, I think. And it put me in a position to open up additional opportunities for me as I progressed throughout my career. Like, for example, being able to attend the FBI National Academy. I already walked in with a degree. And the National Criminal Justice Command College I attended, I already walked into that school with a degree. So those were helpful when it came to going to schools of higher learning and having those degrees already in my back pocket.
That's great. All right, so before we shift to the department, and I know you have so many plans for what you want to do in your first 100 days and, again, over the course of your tenure as chief here, but let's have a little lightning round to get to know you a little bit better. What's your favorite holiday movie?
Favorite holiday movie? Die Hard.
I think that's everyone's favorite holiday movie.
And hopefully that's the most controversial answer I'll give this evening. But yes, Die Hard to me is a Christmas movie.
So what's your favorite kind of music?
My favorite kind of music is 80s music.
Okay. You don't have the hair to match that. What's your favorite kind of food?
Favorite kind of food is pizza.
What about your favorite ice cream?
Favorite ice cream is peanut butter and chocolate.
Nice. And what is your favorite place in Albemarle County?
My favorite place in Albemarle County is Saunders Trail, the Monticello Mountain Trail. I was just there today.
So I know this. What you don't walk alone when you walk on that Saunders Trail. You're usually wearing.
Sometimes I wear a weighted vest to help me with my cardio.
So it's not just a walk up the mountain.
No.
It's you're working.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So what are your priorities for the department as you start your new role?
I have several priorities towards the top of the list. First and foremost, it's modernizing our police department. And by modernizing our police department, I simply mean, catch up with time. Are we doing assessment? Are we best utilizing our technology? Where are we at with our staffing? Are we up to date with our training? Are we using the latest practices and best practices that are out there? So modernizing our police department and making sure that we're not policing like we were 10, 15, 20 years ago, that we keep evolving with the times. Also, out there is officer and community engagement. Held the first of many town halls with our employees and our staff earlier on this week as a meet and greet before I came out to the community, because I felt it was important that officers hear what our vision and direction is from the chief before we set out, and also engaging with the community and keeping our we're fortunate in Albemarle County. We have a very supportive community, and a community that cares deeply for our police department. And I know this from all of the meals and cards that we get sent to us on a daily, weekly basis. And we want to make sure that we maintain that positive relationship with our community. And for those segments of our community that feel that they're isolated and don't have that sense of trust, those are the parts of the county that we need to focus on as well, to make sure that we are transparent and that we are upholding our mission of providing quality service to all members of our diverse community. Also, a couple of items that we're working on. One of our police captains, Captain Kevin Miller, has been working diligently over the past year and a half to incorporate the body-worn camera system into the police department. When I first got promoted Deputy Chief of Police a year and a half ago, I sat down with several commanders, and we needed to get that program up and running. And Kevin took the lead on that. And I'm proud to say that as of this past week, we have begun implementing the body-worn cameras to our patrol officers. And that's just on top of the in-car cameras we currently have in our vehicles, as another layer of transparency and providing an extra witness for community members and officers, because this is not just driven by the community wanting us to have body cameras. It's also our officers want to be able to wear body cameras too out here. Another initiative that I've been working on with several of our commanders over the past year is a comprehensive overhaul of our policy manual. We've partnered with Lexipol, who's been working with us for the past year on updating our policy manual to ensure that we're up to date on state and federal as well as accreditation standards. Our policy hasn't been updated this significantly in the history of the police department. So this is a significant step in updating our policy and in modernizing our police department and make sure that we're adhering to those best practices. Two other things on that long list of priorities is mental health reform. And what I mean by mental health reform is when we started having conversations about a year and a half ago on criminal justice reform, looking for opportunities to reframe the way we provide services. In mental health, based on my conversation with officers from a year and a half ago, they quickly identified this has been an issue decades in the making, but during the pandemic, things really hit a tipping point with the amount of time and that law enforcement was spending on mental health calls for service. So with that, I felt compelled to leverage my position as then Deputy Chief of Police to organize community partners to come up with alternatives than just sending men and women badge and guns to mental health calls for service. And the last thing that's towards the top of my list is staff compensation, making sure when we talk about hiring and retention of officers and diverse officers, as well as civilian staff that are the backbone of our police department, that are behind the scenes making the police department function 24/7, is making sure that our staff is being appropriately compensated. And we're fortunate enough to be working with the county executive's office, our new human resources director, as well as the PPA, and having these dialogues, have these conversations, so that way we can be not only competitive but an attractive police department where people want to come and work.
That's an ambitious first.
It is. It is ambitious, but again, we have a very talented team of commanders here within the police department, and these are things that we've been working on, anticipating this day would come, regardless of who was going to be the next chief of police. We had a mission that we were going to continue to push this organization forward and continue to drive forward through these challenging times.
But it's so exciting to hear such a forward look. And you know, what I hear is a desire to, you know, continue to sort of challenge, you know, how can we do things differently? How can we do things better? How can we evolve with the community that we serve? Which is just, it's so great to hear that. But, you know, you are not alone. So March 1st was the first day for you in your new position, but it was also the first day for 8 other officers and a lot of new roles among your command staff. What do you want the community to know about the ACPD leadership team today?
The ACPD leadership team today, like me, they are a very talented group and a very diverse group of men and women that rose through the ranks of the police department. Some have come from other police departments that brought their experience with them as a patrol officer, and they have all worked their way up through the rank. And so when I met with the county executive office shortly after becoming promoted, I did an internal assessment on the deputy chief of police position and the assistant chief of police position. And at the time, we had 4 very talented and capable captains who were willing to be promoted into those positions. So that gave me the opportunity, based on their skill sets and their training and what they bring to the table, that I could keep the promotions in-house, so to speak, and I didn't have to look outwards to other jurisdictions and pull somebody from another agency to fill those positions. That I was confident, not just I was confident, but other department heads and other community members, as well as county executive's office and the board of supervisors to a degree, they were comfortable with having internal candidates promoted. And going back to your second question, I think that sends a message to our officers that they too can be the chief of police. They too can have that roadmap to the top of the organization and continue that momentum forward. That's
excellent. And some of the new promotions come with a new organizational structure. Tell us a little bit about why taking a look at the structure of the police department was so important to you coming into your new role.
Yes, coming into my new role, based on conversations I had with the leaders within the department, is utilizing this as an opportunity to restructure the internal ranks, make some minor tweaks in order to improve processes and communication, because that was one of the #1 concerns amongst officers, amongst staff, is that we were due for a evolution when it came to how we communicated, and there were some problems because we were growing the department at the base, but we weren't growing it in the mid-management level as well as the upper management level that's consistent. So to streamline the communication flow, the commanders, we all met, we discussed about doing a realignment. So the most significant realignment that occurred within the police department is we actually merged our internal affairs professional standards, Office of Professional Standards, and our training and professional development unit. We merged those into one unit that has oversight by a captain and 2 lieutenants underneath. So 1 lieutenant oversees the accountability in internal affairs. So that way, if a citizen has a complaint or wants to send an accommodation, those go into our internal affairs office. And then our training office continues to ensure their officers maintain their state certifications as mandated by law and through DCJS. And they also work on recruitment and retention. And by having those 2 under the same umbrella, so to speak, it opens dialogue. So that way, if there are concerns or complaints or issues that our officers are having in the internal affairs, they can communicate that directly to training and professional development. So that way they can gear officer training to some of those deficiencies or anything or any shortcomings that we're having. So that way we can intercept it quicker and do remedial training or get the latest up-to-date training at a faster pace. So that way it removes that communication breakdown.
Thank you. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the organization, we've talked a lot about you. Let's talk about the community. What are your priorities for the Albemarle County Police Department and the community?
Much like my previous answer when we talk about priorities, there's actually several priorities. Roadway safety and traffic is up there towards the top of the list, if not at the top of the list. For the past, several people watching may not know this, but in conversation I've had over this past year and a half with our special operations newly promoted lieutenant, or captain now, is Randy Jamerson, and having conversation with him about the concerns about roadways. And we've worked closely with the county executive's office as well as our board members in trying to identify behavior. So what we did was our crime analysts did some research, and we wanted to know if it was a roadway problem or a behavioral problem. So in Albemarle County is one of the most dangerous roads per capita in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and one of the deadliest places per capita in the Commonwealth of Virginia to drive a motor vehicle. And what we're seeing, what our data is showing us, is it's actually driving behaviors that's driving these calls. It's not the roadways themselves. So with some of the top three behaviors being speeding, distracted driving, and not wearing a seatbelt. Those are the three primary offenders in Albemarle County. So as a chief of police, we're going to emphasize roadway safety and traffic safety and try to find innovative and creative ways to make our roadways safer. Acknowledging that this isn't it's not quota driven and it's not a revenue generator. Sometimes, like I met with the officers in the town hall, sometimes if our officers are just staying stationary in a median, that slows traffic down. Or if somebody is driving, you don't necessarily always have to issue them a traffic citation. If our goal is to change the behavior, and the officer has done that without having to issue a ticket, mission accomplished. But the officer does have that discretion to issue a citation when appropriate. So that's traffic safety. Using evidence-based and geo-based policing to address crime in our community is other important. Not necessarily going over like broken window theory or just a pure reactive. I want our officers to be proactive when it comes to patrolling. And what I mean by proactive patrol, not over patrol, but actually engage in community under our geo-based policing model, where officers are encouraged to get out of their vehicles, get to know business owners, get to know the citizens who live in their community, so that way they can build that trust. So that way, when the first time they see a law enforcement officer isn't necessary during a moment of crisis, and they have that trust with the people that they're serving. Recruitment and retention efforts, I talked about that. As our population continues to grow and Albemarle County becomes more urban in certain areas, I've seen over the past 20 years, my time when I was a young officer out on the west side of the county, seeing Crozet, it was nothing but cornfield or nothing but fields and nothing out there. Now it's grown into its own entity out on the west side of the county, and it's a huge population area. But seeing that in the Hollymead area and the Pantops area, and just seeing this growth right across the street from the police department over the 5th Street station, is making sure that we have enough officers out in the street to safely do their job. And not only that, but if a citizen picks up the phone to call 911, we want to make sure that our officer can get there in a timely manner. Also acknowledging that we do have work to do in our rural areas of the county just because of how large Albemarle County is. At this point in time, we only have a finite amount of resources to cover the 720 plus square miles in Albemarle County. But again, those are conversations that we've had with our county executive's office, who's been supportive of our plan moving forward, to make sure that we have adequate resources to provide the services our citizens need. Community engagement, we already talked about, make sure that we stay engaged with our community, and then continue our partnerships with our state, local, and federal law enforcement partners as well. That's an imperative moving forward, that we're all working patch to patch, especially in this day and age when resources are limited, that we're able to lean on each other through these times.
So what trends are you seeing that keep you up at night?
So some of the things that actually keep me up at night regarding law enforcement is, it may sound unusual, but training for our officers. And that's something that the commanders and leaders who worked with me know that's always in the back of my mind, is making sure that our officers have the training and equipment they need to go out there and safely and effectively do their job. I look at not just from how they're communicating with people on the traffic stops and those soft skills, those people skills, so to speak, and making sure that they understand how to de-escalate situations. But I also think about the critical incidents or those hard-edged tactical skill sets that they need when it comes to tragedies like active shooter events. And I want to be able to at night know that the officers have what they need to respond to a number of situations. because God forbid something happens to one of the officers, because that's one of the first things we're going to do is assess, did that individual have the training and equipment they need to safely do this? And if the answer is no, then we're going to have to do an assessment and a hard look at ourselves. So I want to prevent that from happening, prevent that from ever happening. So make sure their officers are well trained.
When you guys do trainings, particularly active shooter type trainings, but crisis intervention training, that's not just sitting in a classroom. What does that look like? No, it's not just sitting in a classroom.
It depends. It depends on the training. Some training is classroom based. During the pandemic, we've had to find innovative ways to train our officers, to include online training. But there's other training, like when we talk about civil disturbance training, and we talk about active shooter training. That has to be hands-on training. Or we talk about those skill sets, like every year officers have to get qualified on their firearms. So that's conducted at the range. And so there's a lot of hands-on practical application training that our officers do. And I prefer the practical application as opposed to the virtual or the classroom settings, because I find that people tend to learn by doing, like our defensive tactics training. You can't do defensive tactics training online or watching videos. There's some training you actually have to go hands-on. Law enforcement is an inherently dangerous occupation, and there are people out there that have violent responses to contact with law enforcement. And I want to make sure our officers have the skills and the training they need to protect themselves and protect the citizens they serve, to as safe as possible handle those type of situations. So anytime our officers can have real world training, we're going to try to give it to them.
What else keeps you up at night? I know I took you off your...
Yeah, no. It's a fair question. Again, mental health calls for service, and real understanding law enforcement's role when it comes to mental health, and also understanding, much like the other thing, like the opioid crisis, law enforcement only has a limited role in those things. There's only so many ways police officers can respond to those type of situations. And unfortunately, they involve handcuffs sometimes, or taking somebody into custody against their will. But that's not treating the problem. I had a conversation with my new friend Jay James this morning on his show, and had the opportunity to go down and tour Bridge Ministries. And I look at the work that he's doing down in Buckingham County as a shining example of somebody that's been in the criminal justice system, but is taking out of the criminal justice system instead of just sitting in jail for certain offenses. They're given an opportunity at true reform, so that way it cuts down on recidivism rates. Because it doesn't do any good if if the cops keep coming out here, locking people up, and then they get out of jail and they're just continue to offend in the community, and we're victimizing our citizens. Mm-hmm. And so at some point in time, we have to break that wheel. We have to break that cycle. And mental health is very much like that. Whether it's mental health or opioid, it's having these conversations like, what role does law enforcement play, and where does it come to a stop, and when does the next service? We're fortunate in Albemarle County right now, with the new DSS director, we're starting to explore that question a little bit deeper on health and human services for those nonviolent offenders, or those mental health, which are two separate issues, and trying to decriminalize and remove that stigma of that criminalization stigma off of mental health. So those two are the last two things. So with mental health, and I'm sorry, there's one more, is cyber crimes as well. Over the past 20 years, seeing the role technology plays with all crimes, and the need, working with a talented group of people, a talented group of detectives when I was a CID commander 5 years ago, collectively identifying the need to form a cybercrimes lab. And I would argue that Albemarle County in Central Virginia has a premier cybercrimes lab, mm-hmm. That's state-of-the-art cybercrimes lab, that has 3 dedicated professionals and subject matter experts that we are very fortunate to have, that actually help other jurisdictions out with their cybercrimes cases as well. But seeing the load of work that they have to manage, that just what technology touches, to include exploitation of children. That's the number one. Very uncomfortable for people to talk about, but just understanding how truly vulnerable our children are in this community, and how with the internet, predators from across the globe, and we've had those cases in Albemarle County where predators will come to Albemarle County thinking that they're picking up children, and we want to have a strong cybercrimes unit to protect our children, protect this community. So just knowing how vulnerable we are with cybercrimes attacks, and also is one of the things that keep me up, and making sure that we're ahead of the game as much as possible when it comes to combating that.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about mental health and the different approach for mental health services. The recommended budget that the county executive recommended last week includes funding, actually using revenues from the newly enacted cigarette tax to help fund what we're calling a community response team. Talk a little bit more about the impact that the rise in mental health calls for service have had on your team, and also what the approach for this community response team would be moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So this conversation again goes back to a year and a half ago. Listen to the officers and voice their concerns about what are we going to do about the mental health calls for service. There are fewer bed spaces in the Commonwealth of Virginia to take those in crisis, and we are spending an inordinate amount of time because of loopholes, the way the laws are written. Some of our officers are spending upwards of 3 days sitting with a patient at a hospital waiting for a bed to open up. And as community members, we have to ask ourselves, is that the most effective use of a law enforcement resources? Well, the code says that we have to maintain custody, and we're fortunate enough to have a partnership with our sheriff's department where they're able to, once they get a bed, that our sheriff's department will assist us, partner with us, and actually transport those patients in crisis. But just the amount of resources that it takes to sit on somebody that has mental health. So with that, I was able to meet with Sheriff Bryant, as well as our Commonwealth Attorney, our County Attorney, County Executive's Office, as well as our partners from Region 10 and other community members, and we came together right around the same time Marcus Alert was starting to take shape, about how it is that we can really change the way that we look at mental health calls for service. And during that time, our DSS, Department of Social Services, was going through a transformation to a leadership change. So we were fortunate to get Khaki Dimick to come over and join the Albemarle County with her background in health and human services, and then partner with the fire department, Chief Eggleston and his staff, because they also respond to mental health calls for service. So we saw this overlap in services. It's like we have some resources here in place, and we're all seeing similar problems. And amongst the group of us, what can we do to really change and re-examine the way we're providing service, with the goal of removing law enforcement, or law enforcement taking a back seat when it comes to mental health calls for service, and also acknowledging from some of our detectives, our CIT experts, crisis intervention training experts, that there are programs around the country. All of them are unique in their own ways, and some are here within the Commonwealth of Virginia, to look at best practices and kind of pick and choose what best applies to Albemarle County. So over the past year and a half, the police department has been able to take a back seat to DSS now and partner with DSS taking the lead on mental health calls for service. And we're looking at hopefully rolling that out this summer, and how the law enforcement is going to support staffing to that is that the SROs, the school resource officers positions that used to be in the school before the school shifted to a different coaching, security coach approach, was those positions have been left unfilled, but are assigned to that mental health services unit. So once this mental health services unit goes live, or crisis response team goes live, the police department will commit resources to that. So with the goal being to partner with fire department and DSS when there's a crisis call for service where there's not some sort of security threat, instead of dispatching a regular officer that's in a sector that might be tied up on a different calls for service, we can dispatch these officers out that are CIT trained, that know the person, or can be in a position to build a relationship with said person and handle it at that level. And there's also some other initiatives that we're currently working with Region 10 as well to help with this initiative. to include finding an alternate location when people that don't need immediate medical attention, that we can take them to an alternate site as opposed to the emergency room. We can take them to an alternate site for Region 10 to conduct an assessment on individuals in crisis to free up an emergency room bed space. So I'm excited about the work, and again, it truly was a team approach to this, that it's just not a police department problem. And again, this is where I think Albemarle County shines, is we have a very diverse group of leaders who can identify a problem, that can collaborate and come together and not worry about ego or who's taking the credit, but recognizes the problem, say we need to work together to fix this problem.
Awesome. I'm hearing so much about partnership, about a team, and I feel like the future of the department is in great hands. And I know they're not just your hands; it's a lot of folks standing beside you, shoulder to shoulder. That's all the questions that I had. Before we get into questions from the audience, know that all the questions that we've received tonight we might not be able to get to. So if we don't get to yours, you can always email the chief at askthechief@albemarle.org, and you can connect with Colonel Reeves offline. But for now, let's get into some of the questions that we've gotten. And the first, we'll reward the eager beaver. The first question we received from the audience this evening was, Colonel Reeves, could you tell us if Detective Wells is your favorite detective of all time? And that was submitted by Detective Wells.
Yes, Detective Wells is my favorite detective of all time, but don't tell him that.
Okay. Next question on a more serious note. This question came in from Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America volunteer leaders. What are the most prevalent kinds of gun violence and crime in our community, and what are your plans to tackle them?
Right now, as far as violent crimes involving firearms are robberies. We're seeing as robberies, and we're also seeing shots fired calls that occur, especially in the northern part of Albemarle County. And one of the things that we've done is partnered. We do have one detective that's assigned to the FBI Safe Street Task Force, and that detective is working very closely with our officers and investigators in consolidating those cases and looking for patterns, and working with our neighboring jurisdictions as well to see if it's the same offender, trying to get the guns off the streets, as well as arrest and prosecute anybody that's committing violent crimes.
We received a comment from a community member via Facebook Live, and they shared that mental health reform is really important as a priority. So they just wanted to share aloud. Thank you for sharing that feedback to us. That's really important to us. But getting to another question, someone noted that Albemarle County is a large county, 726 square miles, and a combination of urban and rural lands in there. The question is, should ACPD consider establishing substations in the county?
Yes, substations is something that is part of the long-term geographic-based policing approach. However, in order to achieve that, we need to have the staffing in order to support having substations. And right now, we do not have the staffing. So our approach right now under the geo-based policing model is to look at when we get new officers, in order to provide 24/7 coverage, redefining how officers respond in beats. And you can look at the beat map and the sector map in Albemarle County, and putting officers in the different beats within the county, as well as the sectors, especially those that are larger, have more terrain to cover. But right now, some of that's being driven on calls for service, or where there are hot spots in the county is where we'll dedicate resources that are above the officers assigned to the different sectors.
Thanks for that explanation. So here's a question that's an opportunity to discuss partner law enforcement agencies. And the question is, what will you do to protect county residents from domestic terrorists? Can you share a bit about the ways ACPD works with other law enforcement agencies in our region to keep us all safe?
Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier on, we are partners with the FBI Safe Street Task Force. We also have partners with the ATF, as well as other federal partners. We do have communication between our crime analysts and Virginia State Police's Fusion Center. And we constantly communicate and collaborate, or if there's a crisis or some sort of domestic terrorist type event that we're alerted to, we will coordinate and communicate with the local, state, federal agencies and determine a best course of action for it.
What does ACPD do to support officer physical and mental wellness?
Yeah, so what the Albemarle County Police Department does to support physical and mental wellness, which are two priorities I explained to our officers earlier on this week, is we do have a wellness program where officers are permitted to work out while they're on duty for a set amount of time. Calls for service obviously pending, and then we also provide no-cost physicals to our officers, as well. As far as mental health, that is something that we're continuing looking for opportunities to expand upon. Right now, we have two psychologists that specialize in law enforcement that are accessible to officers at no cost, out-of-pocket cost to them if they are in crisis. The county, Albemarle County, has the employee assistance program that we can offer to officers that are undergoing a variety of personal issues, to include mental health. We also have a peer support team for officers to go to that will do critical incident management or critical incident debriefing or stress debriefings with our officers after traumatic events or traumatic calls for service that we have available to them. Or sometimes our officers from our crisis team will reach out just to do a pulse check and make sure our officers are okay and how they're handling things. So this is one of those mental health and law enforcement is one of those subjects over the past 5-ish years that has gained a lot of attention because the suicide rate in law enforcement continues to climb. And as a profession across the nation, that is something that chiefs of police are examining on ways to make sure that our officers understand that it's okay not to be okay, that if they need help, that we get them the help and remove that stigma of that you have to have this facade or you have to be this alpha type personality that nothing phases you, that we'd rather make sure their officers are mentally fit to do their job and have the tools that they're okay and they come to work okay, because that's going to reflect in their performance as well.
Absolutely. And it's so great to hear that there's so many resources in place, and continuing to look at again, what can we do more to address those needs. Another question about how ACPD is supporting the team. How is ACPD committing to diversity, equity, and inclusion in its work?
So the Albemarle County Police Department, and speaking to the county as a whole, Albemarle County has invested in a diversity, equity, inclusion position in the county, and that's where it starts there, and it trickles down through all the departments, which Albemarle County is one. And understanding and recognizing the history of law enforcement in our community, and understanding the very controversial history of how people of color have been treated in our community, for decades past, and how that drives the outlook and worldview on how people and how law enforcement, to include the Albemarle County Police Department, is seen within our community. And we talked earlier on about the importance of building those bridges with community members. So recognizing that our community here in Albemarle County is made up of a very diverse population of people, and our officers and our police department, we should strive to not only be a reflection of our community but surpass that. Much like me, coming from a biracial background and understanding different cultures, like I talked about earlier on, have been in a position where I've traveled the world and interacting with people from different worldviews and different places and different countries, and learning to listen to what their beliefs are. And it doesn't make my belief system more correct than their belief system. It's just that's their worldview. And so if you apply that lens to our community, there are people with different backgrounds, different political beliefs, different religious beliefs, and as a public servant, as police officers, we have to recognize that we're oftentimes not just recognize that, but then we also have to hire and have people in our workforce that acknowledge that, because when you get different opinions and different worldviews and different outlooks, to me that's the American story. America's supposed to be this melting pot of cultures, and you apply that same concept to a police department. You have different outlooks and different ideas, and that's where you really start to drive forward. That's where you really start to progress forward, when you're not operating in a silo or an echo chamber, and you're keeping up with the times. So yeah, having diversity, equity, inclusion, making sure everybody has that same voice, that people, we have the public safety pay scale to ensure that that no longer, women are making less than their male officer counterpart, or minorities are making less. So it's all transparent. Coming in, coming from the outside in, with our public safety pay scale, what you're going to be making. The other thing that one of the other initiatives that we started here in the Albemarle County Police Department is Lieutenant Elizabeth Gomez is now going to be spearheading a diversity, equity, inclusion, a peer support team within the police department. So that way, working with our county's diversity, equity, inclusion coordinator, as well as human resources, to better understand the culture within our police department. Mm-hmm. Because we talked earlier about recruitment and retention, mm-hmm. quality people. Well, if the Albemarle County Police Department doesn't have a reputation, or has a bad reputation or bad stigma for diverse people or people of color or women, they're not going to want to work here because of the reputation. So we have to really, establish a baseline of what our culture is, but also provide an outlet or a space for people of color and women officers within our police department to have confidential conversation, have this peer support, and have this outlet where if there are things within our police department need to change, that we can make that change. I've on day one as chief of police explained to our officers that any type of racist, sexist, or homophobic conduct will not be tolerated as a chief of police. There's no place for it here within our police department, and that's something I stand by.
Having those expectations articulated is so important. It sounds like you're, really establishing a really good baseline and making some good investments to try to advance that work. I know, speaking from a different part of the county, right? That work is so important. Albemarle County is we've taken some big steps, I think, over the past couple of years, but certainly we have a long way to go. But it's so great to hear these stories from across the organization of how we're trying to live that value and what that looks like in different departments. So another question from the audience. And actually, I'm going to jump down. So are you guys hiring with all of these great initiatives on retention and recruitment, the public safety pay scale and the transparency that provides? Are you hiring, and what's the process to become a police officer look like?
Yes, the Albemarle County Police Department is currently hiring both certified and non-certified officers. And for more information, you can either visit the Albemarle County Police Department's website, or you can contact the Albemarle County Police Department directly, and they will connect you with our training and professional development unit. And once you make contact, depending on whether you're certified or not, what that entails is a physical fitness test, and then we have a psychological test, as well as a polygraph test. There's also a written test and a interview panel that accompanies this process. So we do have a pretty stringent vetting system, but that is the expectation. It's not about lowering standards because we're desperate to hire officers. We want officers that can come in and do the job, that have the utmost integrity, that are reflective of the citizens they serve. And we don't want to hire people that are coming from other law enforcement agencies. They're fleeing because they have baggage with them, or they're running from an internal affairs investigation, or somebody that has a significant criminal history and bringing them on board as a police officer. Several years ago, we were at the point that we were only hiring 3% of applicants who actually put in. Times have changed and numbers have changed, but we still maintain that high standard because our community, quite frankly, deserves that. They deserve the high standard of police officers that work here in our organization. But yeah, for those of you who are interested in applying, please feel free to apply.
Great. All right. Another question from the audience, and you spoke earlier about one of the things that keeps you up at night is traffic issues in the community. What are your thoughts on red light or other speeding cameras in the community, and how that could be a tool in potentially moving the needle on some of those crash statistics that we're aware of?
Yes, great question. That is something that currently our special operations and our traffic unit is exploring, specifically when it comes to the use of speed cameras. We're going to have additional community conversations regarding speed cameras, because under the county ordinance we can deploy those in school zones. And based on the data that we're seeing There are two specific areas within Albemarle County, off of Rockfish Gap Turnpike as well as Hydraulic Road, where we're seeing a high volume of crashes and speed-related offenses. And what we want to do is explore the opportunity to potentially use speed cameras in those school zones to help make sure that our kids are getting to school safely and help drive down crashes in those areas. And then we're also looking at other uses, application of technology, but it's a balancing act too, because we want to look at technologies that don't overreach, that aren't abuse of people's privacy, and finding out where that balance is between changing behaviors and keeping our roadways safe while respecting privacy, and find that balance and do it in a methodical way and do it in a transparent way where we're engaging the citizens in these conversations before we make these decisions.
Thank you. So another question from Facebook Live. How is the department handling gang crimes and violence in our community, and is that an issue in Albemarle County?
Gangs have historically been an issue in Albemarle County and the greater Charlottesville area. And again, that goes back to the FBI State Street Task Force, and that falls within their purview to tackle the gang crimes, because with gangs come a litany of quality of life issues. Drug trafficking, human trafficking, we talk about prostitution, and you talk about gun violence. That's what occurs in our communities left unchecked. But again, it's about a balance, and actually, having that precision focus on specific gangs and not a umbrella approach to people that might dress like a gang member but aren't gang members, and find a way that we're not profiling people but actually going after these hardcore gangs.
And I imagine geo-based policing has a role in the effectiveness in being able to move the needle on gang violence in the community.
It does. By staying engaged with community members, because quite frankly, our citizens, regardless of where you live, they don't want gangs in their community, period. Regardless of where you live, whether you live in the suburbs or you live in an apartment complex, people don't want crime in their community. They want to be able to live in an area where it's safe, that they can live, they can raise their kids and have family without being terrorized or without having their car stolen, which is another significant issue within Albemarle County, is stolen automobile thefts. But again, that's just part of the issue. Police department, law enforcement only has one role in this, but that's larger, socioeconomic issues that drive some of those behaviors, and in some of these issues we can't arrest our way out of. Mm-hmm. However, when you're dealing with the hardcore gangs that come in and that are dealing with the trafficking, human drug trafficking, those are the ones that we got to work with our state and federal partners to ensure that they get locked up and put away and don't come back into our community.
Thank you. So a question that came in through the Q&A, what demographics will be recorded with records of police interactions with civilians, or are collected when you have interactions with civilians?
Yes, it's my understanding that on the Albemarle County Police Department, I know on our website that we do report out on the demographics whenever we make contacts with civilians during traffic stops. That's a state mandate, and we do report those numbers to the state police. So yes, we do track our citizen contacts on traffic stops.
And another question that addresses race within the department. So you said that a diverse police department was important. How many minority police officers and employees does Albemarle County have in comparison to white employees? And I think looking forward, what's your plan to address what may be a disparity there?
I believe it's a 70-30 ratio with women and minority officers to white male officers. And this goes back to the conversation we have about pay and compensation. In order to be competitive in our market, regardless of who it is we're trying to recruit. We were fortunate this past year, working with the county executive office, that we were finally able to get our starting salary for law enforcement officers above that $37,000 range. And when I go out to the community and tell people, especially over these past several years of what law enforcement, the evolutions, law enforcement, the hard times that law enforcement had over the past several years, that these officers only making, some of them are starting off at $37,000 a year. we have to do better than that. You're only talking, especially in this job market right now, where you can get paid even more money for doing something that's not as risky as law enforcement. And I ask people, would you want your loved ones or family members putting their lives on the line or enduring what you're seeing on TV for $37,000 a year? So understanding this, the PBA as well as the County Executive's Office and our Board of Supervisors are trying to take steps to remedy that along with our human resources. So to me, that's where it starts. We could talk about recruiting and recruiting at doing job fairs, which our training professional development unit does. They go to a variety of places within the Commonwealth of Virginia as well as here, targeting African American schools or Hispanic population or military veterans. But if you don't have a decent starting salary, we're going to miss that opportunity across the board. People aren't going to want to come work here unless they have a deep tie to work here. So recruitment efforts are there, but we got to get our pay so we're to a point where we're competitive with other law enforcement agencies. And that's a phenomenon you're seeing all across the board. It's not exclusive to Albemarle County, and just competing with the fact of changing the perception of law enforcement. Because what we're seeing also is across the country, fewer and fewer people want to do this job. And it truly is a calling, but unfortunately, because of the stigma of law enforcement, it's not as appealing as a career anymore. In a recent conference I went to earlier on in February, one of the representatives from DCGS got up and talked about how he had 22,000 certified law enforcement officers just a few short years ago, and as of this year, there was, I believe, 18,000 certified law enforcement officers. So that's across the Commonwealth, that's 4,000 less people out there protecting and serving our community. So we've really got to wrap our heads around that and then tackle, in order to make it appealing and attractive to diverse applicants to come and work here. But again, going back to culture too, we got to make sure we have a culture in the police department that welcomes all people of all backgrounds that want to come and work here. So it goes hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I imagine that the peer support network that you spoke about, Lieutenant Gomez's initiative, are those common in police departments? Is that something that sort of sets Albemarle County Police apart from some of the other peer jurisdictions?
I don't know. I can't speak to the other jurisdictions. It's the first that I've heard that's exclusive to minorities. Not to say that there are not others out there. I'm unaware of others that are specifically focused on women and minority officers.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's reach back. What made you want to get into law enforcement? What brought you, here now to chief? But what made you really want to get into law enforcement as you started your career?
That's a great question. I've always just had this. My father was a veteran from Vietnam, and then my younger brother also served and retired from the military. He's actually overseas now, serving our country, and in a different capacity. And I think it's just within our family that we want to serve and just have. I can't explain it. It's a calling, wanting to help those in need. And I've always hated a bully, and just gravitating towards that. I'm a big movie buff, and I like to read, and I've always gravitated those characters, those guardian protector type characters. And just throughout my life, I've through military service, I've always found law enforcement appealing. That eternal struggle between good and evil, right and wrong, and I just wanted to be a part of that. And so coming out of the military, getting into law enforcement, which is paramilitary in a lot of ways, and finding the closest thing to that kinship that I had back when I was a soldier in this environment, it was appealing. And then I just found I was fortunate enough to apply the things I learned both from the military, my travels around the world, through my own personal life experiences, both good and bad, to this profession, and found myself just steadily working my way up to this point in time as chief of police. And the best thing I can do in this role is be that mentor and that coach to others. And I'm at the point in my career now that I've been doing this since 1996, and where I want to start giving back, and I want to start giving back to those officers that are the next generation, because we all have a shelf life, and I want to be able to walk out the door at the end of my career knowing that I left Albemarle County Police Department in a better place than I found it.
That's great. Colonel Reeves, it's been so great to get to talk to you tonight. We wanted to have sort of your debut into the community be a little bit different, but COVID being what it is. I really appreciate your time tonight. I know you're a very busy gentleman, and you've got a lot on your mind. But really, thank you everyone who tuned in with us tonight. If we didn't get to your question, or if you have a question that you think of later, you can always get the chief at askthechief@albemarle.org. Really appreciate everyone tuning in with us this evening on this new format for us, and we hope to try this again soon. Thanks so much, Albemarle.